Cold War, a colossal showdown between the two biggest camps in human history. In 1946, the PM of the United Kingdom announced the descent of the Iron Curtain, an invisible line that sliced the world in two. A very Cold War was about to begin. To figure out what exactly the Soviets were up to, the British gentlemen needed men who were loyal, reliable, loved their tea and scotch, and most importantly, wouldn't just compile the entire British agent roster and hand it over to Stalin. Now, let's just rewind the clock and back to 1922. Little George Blake is born in the Netherlands. Born in the peaceful era after World War I, he was supposed to have a peaceful, grateful life. His biggest dream was to become a minister in the Dutch Reformed Church, but unexpectedly at the age of 17. What appeared before him was not God, but the Germans. War even bigger than World War I had begun. His dream of becoming a minister was dashed, but his legendary life was just beginning. He was about to become the most hated enemy in British history, the man who single-handedly paralyzed their entire intelligence system, George Blake. When Germany declared war, the Dutch were optimistic. Germany? Well, just hold out for a few months, and once the British and French come here, they will be done. But neither of two wishes came true. The Dutch surrendered in just 5 days, and the Allied forces were cornered at Dunkirk, basically waiting to become fish food. Young George joined the resistance, but got thrown in jail immediately. Luckily, the German officer saw he was a 17-year-old kid, so he gave him a beating, and then simply let him go. So, George Blake went full European parka mode. First, he slipped out of the Netherlands and snuck into France. And he just realizes that France had already surrendered too. Out of options, he kept moving south, climbed over the Pyrenees Mountains into neutral Spain, and finally caught a boat from Gibraltar to make his escape to England. The British realized this young man was very smart. By 1943, he was a top recruit training at a naval base. He worked incredibly hard and ranking at the top of his class in both theory and practice. In fact, he was commissioned as a sub-lieutenant before his training was even complete. That is, until the British discovered a slightly awkward problem. Blake had a peculiar physiological quirk. He fainted the moment he went underwater. So that was the end of his naval career. 1 whole year of training just literally down the drain. While he was moping, a mysterious group approached him. Hey dude, who wants to kick those Germans, cutie? Soft little ass? Just join us at MI6. Sir, we have never publicly acknowledged the existence of the so-called MI6. George asked, why me? His superiors smiled. Isn't it obvious? It's surely because you're so outstanding. At MI6, George trained like a beast. He was pumped and ready to go out there, crush the Germans, and come home be a hero. But after months of intense training, the war has ended. Before George could even graduate spy school, that man with a little mustache from Germany graduated earlier. So George was unemployed again. MI6 saw he had nothing to do and they weren't about to let a talent like his go to waste. Dude, how about just go to Cambridge and learn some Russian? We have work for you to do. We don't know why Britain insists on sending all their best agents to learn Russian. But sure enough, after 2 years at Cambridge, George started thinking the Soviet Union might have, perhaps, possibly made a few contributions to the war. Finally, he got his first mission, Vice Consul in Korea. This mission was to gather intelligence on Korea, but he was struck by what he saw the moment he arrived. In his autobiography, he wrote, I could not imagine how high-ranking officials could walk past beggars and into luxury restaurants with such utter indifference. Fortunately, or unfortunately, these days won't last much longer. In 1950, the Korean War started, and Seoul fell in just 3 days. The South Korean president ran away very fast, but he just forgot to tell the embassies to run. George Blake had no choice but to surrender alongside his colleagues. At first, they didn't give them much trouble, as Britain was technically a neutral party. However, things got awkward when Britain suddenly declared war. This left George Blake and his colleagues in a terrible spot in an instant. They went from being neutral diplomats to enemy prisoners. They were all rounded up and taken to Pyongyang. In 1951, the Soviet embassy sent a care package to the board prisoners. By sheer coincidence, the only books in there were as Capital and Lenin's works in Russian language, and only George could read them. To kill the time, Blake read every single one of those books. After finishing them, he had an epiphany. he decided to switch the team. He weighed his three options: stay and rebuild Korea, go home and join the Communist Party, or use his MI6 clearance to become a super spy. Wait, a super spy? That sounds so cool. And so, during a midnight stroll, he quietly slipped a note written in Russian to a guard. Listen, I wish to speak with the Soviets. Yes, face to face. 6 weeks later, a KGB boss arrived. George cut to the chase. I'm MI6, and I want in, but I have 3 conditions. 1, I only spy on countries attacking communism. 2, do not pay me. My only cause is my ideal. And 3, no special treatment here. Treat me like dirt, just like everyone else. The Soviets were stunned. A spy who works for free and refuses extra food. Deal. The agreement was reached swiftly. The Soviet intelligence officer informed him that his situation was known only to the highest echelons of the KGB. In all official documents, he would appear only under a single code name, Demon. And so, following the end of the war, he was sent back to Britain by the Soviets. Wait, remember the beginning of the video, where we mentioned that a group of Englishmen were looking for someone loyal, reliable, and loved tea and Scotch whiskey? Well, they found George Blake. Just like that, George was assigned to manage classified documents. The primary responsibility of this role was to ensure that absolutely no one photographed these top-secret files and sent them to the Soviets. And his part-time job was to photograph those top-secret files and send them to the Soviets. After more than a year of snapping photos, the KGB suddenly said, "All right, that's enough. We've completely infiltrated the British intelligence system." At this point, Stalin is getting the news faster than the British Prime Minister. To make himself even more useful, Blake successfully applied for a transfer to the front lines of the Cold War, West Berlin. His new job was to vet every single spy defecting from the Soviet Union. His other new job was to send the names of every single one of those defectors straight to Stalin. In 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles had a big idea: Operation Gold. Basically, dig a massive tunnel under the Soviet base and tap their phone lines. The CIA, feeling inexperienced in digging holes, outsourced it to the British. The project manager? George Blake. So, before the CIA shoveled a single scoop of dirt, Moscow already had the blueprints. To protect Blake, the KGB decided let them dig. Then, the Soviets spent years speaking absolute nonsense into the phones. The CIA recorded 70,000 hours of audio and hired 300 translators, only to listen to the world's longest Russian podcast about nothing. In 1956, the Soviets accidentally discovered the tunnel and invited the world press to see this shameful imperialist act. Dulles was humiliated but told himself, "At least we got some intelligence." Just as Blake thought he was in the clear, trouble arrived. In 1958, a high-ranking Polish spy, Korean Sniper, sent a letter to the CIA. "You have a Soviet mole in your team. He has been leaking everything to Soviet, and his codename is Diamond." MI6 was struck by pure panic. There is a traitor among us. We must find our most reliable man to root him out. So they turned to George Blake. "George, you are the only one who can handle this mission." Blake didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The bad news is his cover was blown, and MI6 was investigating him. The good news is the man in charge of the investigation was himself. He immediately turned around and fired off a message to the KGB. "A traitor codename Sniper has sold me out. Deal with him. Fast." In 1960, the KGB finally pinned down Sniper's identity. He was a high-ranking Polish official, but before they could make their move, Mitchell Gorniewski beat them to the punch. He defected to the United States, bringing along his mistress and 10,000 marks of embezzled public funds from his office. Before the war ended, he had served as a puppet for the Germans in Poland. Once he arrived in America, he would often get blackout drunk and rant. "The German guy with the mustache isn't dead. I am the son of Tsar Nicholas. Call me your majesty." The CIA agents were speechless. They ultimately concluded the guy was a total lunatic and sent him straight to a psychiatric hospital. Yet, buried deep within his incoherent ramblings was a single grain of truth. "That British spy codename Diamond, who stopped sending until in 1960. I'm not crazy. I will reclaim my rightful place as Emperor of Russia." In fact, it was all a big misunderstanding. The KGB had simply cut off the flow of intelligence from Diamond to Poland. But by a stroke of pure coincidence, Blake happened to be transferred to Lebanon in 1960, and he was the only personnel from the Berlin station who fit the timeline perfectly. It was a classic case of even a blind cat finds a dead rat. Just like that, Blake was in a crushers. In April 1961, Blake was summoned back to London for interrogation. For 3 days, he was airtight. His story didn't have a single leak. The British didn't resort to torture, and they were rapidly running out of options. That was until the interrogator decided to play the psychological card. George, we know you turned because you were orchard in Korea, or perhaps they had some leverage over you. We understand. You were for stint to this. This was the moment Blake's ego got the better of him. He slammed his hand on the table and shot up from his seat. No! No one tortured me. I did it for my beliefs. I did it voluntarily, and I did it for free. Don't you dare think I'm some spineless coward. The interrogation room fell into a dead silence. It took a few seconds for it to sink and Blake realized that in his desperate attempt to recall, he had just handed over every single one of his secrets. The KGB offered a heap of prisoners in exchange for Blake, but MI6 was absolutely livid. Blake's arrogance had left them utterly humiliated. The British government made their stance clear. We don't care how many people you offer, there will be no trade. We're locking him up for 42 years, not a single year less. And so, Blake spent 5 years in prison, passing the time by learning Arabic. Once he realized the spy swap was looking more and more hopeless, he let out a sigh. Whatever, if they won't trade for me, I'll just see myself out. While in prison, he assembled his own Avengers. There are 1 Irish Republican Army and 2 anti-nuclear activists. Including himself, the 4 of them made a decision. Break out. One night, they opened their cell doors with almost no resistance, then crept across the prison yard, pried open a fence gate in a corner with their bare hands, and escaped. Yes, with all the commotion and noise throughout the entire incident, the British police didn't hurt at all. That's why we say, heaven is where the police are British, the chefs are French, and the workers are German. Blake smuggled himself into Belgium and then drove a car into East Germany. Finally, under the arrangement of the Soviet Union, he was taken to Moscow, where he was celebrated and awarded medals as a hero. The Soviets provided him with a 3-room apartment, and he spent his later years writing his memoirs. When he saw the Soviet flag slowly lowered and replaced by the Russian flag in his later years, he wasn't particularly disappointed. Perhaps this was the answer to the life of this legendary figure. Thank you for watching the video until the end. Creating long-form content is quite a journey, so if you enjoyed this, please subscribe and like.